the other thing we want to do today is we want to be able to put all of our bureaucratic agencies into one of four different categories: independent regulatory agencies, cabinet department, government corporations, or independent executive agencies. So we're going to talk first today about independent regulatory agencies. These are the main ones we're talking about when we're talking about bureaucracy most of the time. These are going to be some of the big famous ones, have important goals. What we see in the picture here, this is the Federal Reserve Building in Washington, D.C. This is the central bank of the United States. They regulate banking. They control the money supply. They control the interest rates that people get on loans and things like that. And they are independent from control of the president or control of Congress. So they have a goal that should not change regardless of who the president is. They want to make sure that the economy is strong. So it doesn't matter if it's President Obama or President Trump, the Federal Reserve should be performing the same role all the time. That's why we would consider them independent. They're regulatory because they're regulating banks. So we're going to get into what independent regulatory agencies do and some examples of those. All right, first of all, an independent regulatory agency is a line agency. That's what we were just talking about, because independent regulatory agencies are going to mostly provide, they're going to protect you or provide a service of some kind to you. So they are line agencies. They have independent goals from the president that's in charge or the current members of Congress. They're going to regulate independently. That's what their name says, independent regulatory. So let's think about what those words mean. Regulate means they are helping to enforce the law. It is going to be their job to carry out the law and enforce the law. So the Federal Reserve might be enforcing laws for banks. The Environmental Protection Agency would be enforcing laws for businesses. The Federal Election Commission enforcing election laws. So they're helping to enforce the law. That's one of the president's main roles that obviously one person can't do. The other thing that's important here is that they are independent. And what that means is that they perform their day-to-day job outside of the control of the president or Congress. So we'll get into this stuff later. They can be, indirectly controlled because the president picks the person in charge and Congress controls the budget. But president and Congress cannot control them day to day. So they're just government workers doing their job, regulating and enforcing the law. We're going to get into their to the lawmaking powers later this week also, but they're going to engage in some minor lawmaking. So I'm going to give you an example I'm going to use over and over and over again. Congress is going to pass laws that are pretty broad, don't have a lot of details, they're kind of vague, and that's because Congress is a policy generalist. Like we said, they don't really know the rules. But the bureaucratic agencies are the policy specialists. They know all the details about their topics. So I'm going to give you an example with the Environmental Protection Agency. Congress can pass a law like the Endangered Species Act, and they would say, hey, we should protect endangered species. That's not too hard to come up with, but it will be the EPA that will make some of the minor details of the law, like which animals are endangered, how many animals exist for an animal to be endangered, all that kind of stuff. So that's what we mean by some lawmaking power. All right, now the people in charge of these agencies are picked by the president. When a new president comes in, they can replace the leadership. But once a president picks the person, they exist independently. So the president cannot get rid of them without any cause. So like if the president doesn't agree with them anymore, that's too bad. They're independent. They exist separately from the president. But if they broke a law or something, they could be removed from office. So this is what gives them their independence. They get put in office and then they do their job without interference from the president. Now, in some cases, instead of one person in charge, they're a commission or a board. So like there's a group of people in charge. Like the Federal Reserve is run by a group of people. The Federal Election Commission run by a group of people. But same thing there. Like they exist. Once they're put into place, the president does not have the opportunity to fire them. And in the cases where groups are in charge, their terms are staggered so that, and they last longer than one president. So that way, like right now, a commission would be made up of leaders that some were appointed by Obama and some were appointed by Trump. So So the leaders have to agree on what that agency is going to do. The independent regulatory agencies, since they regulate, they're going to engage in a process we call rulemaking. That means they make the details of the laws passed by Congress. So they're going to make some details of regulation. So like Congress can come up with something broad like cars should not pollute much. And then the EPA is going to come up with an exact amount of pollutant particles that a car can emit, because the EPA is going to include environmental scientists and experts that know things like that. Congress will not. So the goal of these agencies is to serve the public interest in whatever their little segment of the economy might be, if that's elections or environment or TV and radio or labor, things like that. So they're going to serve the public interest, and they're going to make little details of the law that will serve the public. So since they have a small role in policy making, we're going to end up talking about them a lot later, because they're going to be a part of what we call an iron triangle. So they're going to be lobbied by interest groups. Interest groups are going to want lots of different things, services, and favors from these regulatory agencies. So we'll be ending up talking about these again later in the year when we're talking about iron triangles. And these agencies are also a big part of a problem with interest groups that we call the revolving door. Think about a revolving door, how it just kind of spins in a circle. So this is an idea that describes how people work for the government and then they leave the government to go work for interest groups. Sometimes they leave interest groups and come get a job running the government. So this is one of the main ways that interest groups control what happens behind the scenes in the government. But we're going to talk about this a lot more later in the year when we're talking about interest groups and the problems with interest groups. All right, so here's some examples that you probably know. We'll go through some of these a little more later, but big examples of independent regulatory agencies would be the EPA. This is the biggest one. Started in the 70s. Obviously, the Environmental Protection Agency exists to protect the environment. They do that when a Republican is president and when a Democrat's president. Their goals do not change when a new president comes aboard. So we know they're a line agency. They exist to serve you. The Federal Election Commission is an agency that exists to monitor federal elections. So they control some regulation of money donation limits and stuff like that, making sure that campaigns are run appropriately and all that kind of stuff. The Federal Communication Commission, the FCC, they monitor the broadcast airwaves. So they have control over TV and radio stations. They can monitor and control what content can be broadcast and all that kind of stuff. We're going to talk about them later. And the Fed, the Federal Reserve, is our central banking system, and they control all of the rules and enforce all of the policies about banks all around the country. So these are just some of the examples. These are a lot of the ones that will come up that we'll be familiar with and you might have to use in an example if you're writing on a FRQ. All right, so that's independent regulatory agencies. It is so important. All the information about them is right there in their name. Remember, they are independent, meaning they are not controlled by the president and Congress. They are regulatory, meaning that they are enforcing the law. So when we're going to look at different agencies, if they're doing those two things, that's an independent regulatory agency. Tells us a lot about them. Now, we've got 3 other types of bureaucratic agencies, and we're going to talk about those in just a second.